Okay, I'm going to pause this conversation for a moment and open it up to you into the room and people watching this online. I've got a few questions already from the online audience. Just to hear what your questions are. If it's a question for one of the specific panelists, if you could be clear about that. Otherwise, I'll kind of choose who to pose the questions to. And if you could also tell us your name and where you're from, that would be great. Who would like to start with questions? Okay, I'm going to start with some online questions. So I've got my first question is Matthew Cole from the Autonomy Institute in London wants to ask, how could UBI reduce economic inequality? So I'm going to ask that as a question to all the panelists in a minute. Another question, Darendra, who's a PhD student from King's College in London, wants to ask everyone on the panel, using the context of developing countries, if UBI becomes the new standard or norm in social protection, do you think it will affect or change significantly the implementation of existing social programs? That's something you've been talking about, David. I'm going to take one more question from online. Kelly Hawdry from Fairtrade International in Germany wants to know, what are the views of the panelists on setting wage benchmarks? That is, minimum salary thresholds for targeted sectors where the majority of the poor workforce is engaged, so such as agriculture, like tea plantations or the garments industry. This is something that's being promoted by fair trade standards on hired labour. So let me, unless there's another question in the room for now, nobody else with a burning question for now? Okay, let me put those three questions to the panel. Why don't we start with you, Shamika?
Sure.
Okay. No, let me just take the first
Hang on.
one.
No, Shamika. Sorry, Shanta. Shamika.
Oh,
and then we'll come to you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the UBI replacing food, fuel, and fertilizer in the Indian case is really a good replacement. And in that sense, it's revenue neutral as far as those specific subsidies are concerned. But the question is really regarding UBI becoming a norm and what does it mean for existing social protection. Other than those three, in economies such as India, where the markets don't really exist, and particularly healthcare and basic education, which very few countries really have a good, well-functioning private sector for, I think the role of the state is not going to diminish by rolling out of a UBI. So we will have to rethink some kinds of social protection, but fundamental role as far as matters that are of equal opportunity in healthcare and education, I think they will remain. They are not really under threat because of this new instrument of social protection coming in. The minimum wages question is really, I'd again refer to the NREGS, that you can set basic minimum based on cost of living, and you can account for newer things that enter the consumption basket over time. But again, there are lots of regional variations. Input costs vary, services costs vary, and that's why we have a lot of variation within India as far as the minimum wages are concerned. And that's why it's not set by the central government. It is really set by the regional state governments. As far as the Cole, the Autonomy Institute question from Cole, UBI reducing economic inequality, this is where I say that while in the immediate run, if you are to give the same amount to everyone, it really just shifts the existing distribution upward. So it really is a shift. But if we do have a good tax system, then you can make it revenue neutral for the rich and have more remaining for the poor. So as David said, what's the point of giving amounts which are so small? Well, actually, it makes a significant difference at the bottom of the income, quintile. It might not. It's a marginal improvement or a rise for the rich, but for the poor, it's a significant change. So over time, this universality itself can be tweaked and innovated and improved over time to make it one where economic equality actually becomes better over time.
Great, thank you, Shanta. You wanted to come in next.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually, Shamika answered that question very well, but let me just add then one more point. in response to something that David said earlier about why would governments agree to this if they're already not interested in redistributing income, and why would they agree to a universal basic income? The fact is that in many governments you have forces that are pro-poor and forces that are anti-poor. But the difference with universal basic income is that it actually empowers the poor themselves. Because of the fact that now everybody knows exactly how much they're supposed to get. And that creates some pressure from the bottom for the government to be accountable. Whereas previously, with all of these complicated schemes, they could always say, oh, well, you weren't supposed to receive this because of the formula that was used didn't include you. So there's a big shift in governance when you introduce UBI. The way that we've been talking about. And that is what's going to help you reduce inequality and reduce poverty.
Great, thank you. Ilkka, same set of questions to you, please.
If we simply take the money that's used for current social benefits and that are currently targeted, and take that same amount of money and use it to set up an UBI scheme, you will increase inequality, because instead of simply targeting poor people, you're also giving out money to rich people. So if you only implement an UBI and don't do anything else, you are increasing inequality. But if you find new revenue to fund a larger social state, larger amount of benefits, then you can reduce inequality. But it's not UBI that is doing it. It's the fact that you are taxing more the rich, getting a larger slice of money to the social benefit system. And if that's something you can do and want to do, you can do that regardless of UBI. You can increase taxes on the rich and increase targeted unemployment benefits or targeted disability benefits or whatever. It's so sort of combining higher taxes with UBI and claiming that the effects of higher taxes are because of UBI, I think is not a fair representation of the facts.
Okay, David, let me
Well,
ask you what you want to
can I basically just
respond?
agree with what Ilkka said about income inequality and the choices that exist there? Agree with Shanita about equal opportunity depending on health, education, water supplies, things that basic income doesn't actually touch. I mean, presenting it as some have done, that this will solve everything and make it only rain at night time is quite unrealistic. That it will have, it could have certain benefits, but it doesn't solve everything. Agree with Shankar that empowering people is what I think everyone is concerned about. And one can see ways in which universal basic income may do that, but so have pensions or disability benefits. That I don't think there's any difference really. That if people have more resources, then they can buy more for themselves, make decisions for themselves. And the question then is, to me, which is the most effective and redistributive way that's best for those who are worst off and does most to reduce inequality. And I think there is a disagreement about whether a basic income is so effective, simply because it's giving. If you take in a certain amount of money, it's giving it out to everyone, whereas other systems are trying to give it out, maybe with leakages and not wholly effectively, but is trying to give it, for the most part, to those who are in greatest need.
Okay, let me take another. I'm going to take another question online, actually, that's just popped into the inbox. Takatoshi Sakasi, who's an MSc student at the LSE, wants to ask, does introducing UBI systems affect formal insurance markets or informal risk-sharing activity in face of adverse income shocks? So let me park that question and just check whether there's others in the audience. If you have a microphone at the back here, please.
Thank you. My name's Abigail Hunt. I'm from ODI. I just had a question. I have to admit, I don't know too much about UBI, which is why I'm here. So I just wanted to say that I've been reflecting on the conversation in terms of women's economic empowerment. And it seems to me that there could be some potential here. For example, if women for the first time are able to get hold of economic resources, that could potentially increase their bargaining power in the household over economic resources and their control over money. And of course, there's always been very much question about the unpaid care and domestic work, which is disproportionately carried out by women and is unpaid. So again, I see that there might be some potential in that if all members in the household are receiving a basic income, that might help both men and women to think about how to manage paid and unpaid care and work and labour market engagement. Now, these are, some of my hypotheses based on what we're hearing today in the potential outcomes for gender equality and women's empowerment. And I just wondered with the panel if that's something that you'd seen coming out of any of the trials or looked at in a kind of household level so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Question at the front here.
Hi, my name's Stephen Ayres. I'm from the House of Commons International Development Committee, which is the parliamentary committee that scrutinises Department for International Development. So obviously I'm interested in the political feasibility, and I'd argue that in some countries it's actually moving in the wrong direction in many ways, and even where there is evidence to support the efficacy of UBIs, it doesn't necessarily correlate with enhanced political support. An example of this would be a recent review that the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, ICAI, did into DFID's use of cash transfers, which was broadly positive, but was reported as DFID exporting the dole, essentially. And I did get the sense that there was a sort of tangible, or at least from my perspective, sort of hardening of attitudes towards that form of development assistance as a result, despite the fact that the evidence was saying quite the opposite. And I think like a major barrier to the political feasibility is that no one's actually done it yet, and it's a big political gamble, really, to unroll a UBI on a countrywide scale with no other country having done it. So my question is there any one country or set of countries that are particularly close to implementing a UBI, and what will it take politically to kind of push them over the edge?
Interesting question. Thank you. And there was a hand at the back, woman in the black sweater.
Hi, I'm Tessa. I'm self-employed at the moment. And my question for the panel is, how do you guys think UBI will affect entrepreneurship, and in particular social entrepreneurship? I think what's resonated most with me, in particular what Shanta was saying about giving people more agency and more drive to actually do things more meaningful in terms of work. So not doing the boring jobs, doing stuff that actually matters. So I'm curious to know how you think entrepreneurship will be affected.
Great. Nice, diverse set of questions. Thank you for that. Let me start with David with the women's economic empowerment question, because you were the person who talked about childcare and whether this might have some perverse outcomes for women. Do you want to tackle Abigail's question?
Well, in general, it seems to me women have gained from being in formal employment. A lot remain outside that and dependent on male earnings, and that marginally might be affected by this. But again, I keep coming back to the point about if it's an income adequate to live on, then that has potentially big effects, and quite big effects on insurance market, as Mr. Sakoshi's question was about. But if it's a very small amount, then you haven't really changed that relationship very much. And the same applies to social entrepreneurship. If it's a very tiny income, then how is it going to have much impact on that? If I can just add a note about being countries close to a universal basic income. It really, I mean, there's a lot of talking up of universal basic income as something that's about to happen. Where it's been considered, like a Swiss referendum or the French presidential election, it's lost. And the reason, to my mind, is because people do have a whole set of values that they associate with citizenship and what is fair, and it seems to me that the people who are advocating UBI have got to explain why the general population is going to be willing to fund entrepreneurs, however virtuous and original they are, or artists, musicians, or surfers, and be willing to fund that at a level that's anywhere near adequate to live on.
Okay. Ilkka, can I ask you to respond to the insurance question and maybe to the entrepreneurship question as well, please?
The insurance question, I think any sort of social benefit system has an effect, of course. You have a statutory social security system, regardless of whether it's a UBI type system or a more targeted system. It has an effect on people's need for different kinds of insurances. But the level of benefit is quite important. I would address the women's job market issue, and I think formal employment is the key to empowering women, and simply handing out money is, I'm sure is an improvement in some situations, but for example in the context of Finland, where the benefit system is conditional on looking for work and taking up job training or language training, this sort of thing, is important in the sense that it really gets the woman out of the household. Simply giving out UBI, it could very well lead to the money simply going to the family bank account. The women stay at home and do not really become more empowered. But having the social transfers conditional on looking for work and going to job training could actually lead to employment.
Okay. Shamika, let me come to you next. I mean, feel free to answer any of them, but I was particularly interested in your response to Stephen's question about, even in the face of evidence that there may be positive outcomes of UBI, and even if you adjust taxation systems to mean that you're not having similar levels of, that richer people are paying for it, basically. You still have to sell, in a sense, the kind of, the Bill Gates is getting actually the same amount of view argument, even if there's, there's a clear reason why that's not in fact the case. Doesn't it remain a very difficult political sell? And then any of the other questions, if you'd like to respond to those.
Sure. So let me start out by saying that, the motivation for UBI will be very country specific. Finland might be doing it because of totally different reasons than India will. And let me also be very clear that in the Indian case, the biggest appeal of UBI is absolute poverty. It has very little to do with automation. In fact, as a policy decision, there is a great movement towards plugging this leakage in the system. And it's really from the efficiency point of view that UBI has been put forth by the finance ministry. It is going to be a hard sell, but the idea is already planted in the political narrative. It is being openly discussed. And also remember, in the Indian case, we've had several pilots with unconditional and conditional cash transfers. In fact, we evaluated a couple of them in Andhra Pradesh, which is one of the fastest growing and progressive states in the south. And, just to tell you, it made an impact on, the average impact was not very much. But if you looked at the distribution, then you did see that poverty levels reduced. But, amongst the relatively better off, the amount was too small. So they went back into the casual labor markets. So people self-select. So it will really depend on the amount that is getting transferred to the households for them to make up, these decisions about should they be, gainfully self-employed. Now, remember, at very, abject levels of poverty, self-employment, while it sounds very glamorous, is really a hand-to-mouth existence. So if there is this, slight nudge in the form of a small cash transfer, it really does improve the quality of life. So on an average, though you might not find an impact, I think in India we should be looking out for the distributional impact in the left tail of income. On the gender, I'm particularly keen, on that question on the gender, is it going to have, is microfinance literature over the last 25 years, and I've contributed a lot to this. Microfinance has shown that, when women have access to cash, they are more empowered, and it's not just them. The children eat better, the height and weight is there, improving relatively better. Children stay in school. So there are many unintended consequences of women in the household getting access to this kind of support. And towards that, in India, we're making a push towards doing some kind of a gender audit of the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and the mobile. Because this is the trinity that you will hear Prime Minister Modi talk about constantly, that this has to be the infrastructure based on which any of these social protection schemes really ought to be planted. And then we need to find out how many women have access to Jan Dhan, how many women are enrolled, or how many are left out of that 7% that you quoted in the beginning. And mobile phone, how many women have access to these phones? So in terms of gender, I think it will have a larger impact on women, but we need to know how many women are part of the network right now to benefit from it.
Great, thank you. And Shanta, I saw you nodding furiously. Come in on any of those questions. I'd like to hear your perspective on the women's economic empowerment point, but any of the questions as well.
I actually have comments on all 4 questions.
Go ahead.
First, just to add to Takatoshi's question about insurance markets and adverse shocks. One of the things that we observe in poor countries is that one of the aspects of poverty is the uncertainty associated with the fact that, at the end of the month, you may not be able to feed your children. And this has effects on people's mental health. The anxiety actually depletes their cognitive skills, and they're able to work less. And, you find people in these low-level equilibrium traps. What UBI can do is actually alleviate some of that uncertainty. Because that no matter whether you have work or not, at the end of the month, you'll still get this check with which to feed your children. So there's a double benefit in terms of the insurance benefit. Then let me take Stephen's question from the House of Commons about why this is not getting political salience, in addition to the points that have been made so far. I would say it's very simple. Politicians don't like this, because it actually reduces their power. They can't use poverty alleviation programs for political patronage. This is taking away their ability to manipulate the system to be able to increase their chances of getting elected. So it's not surprising that this is receiving political resistance. But that's precisely the point. That's why we need this, because political manipulation is what gets in the way of people actually benefiting from these programs. And then just let me add to whether the countries that are close to adopting it and answer the entrepreneurship question incidentally. What I'm seeing is that the countries in the Gulf, these are high-income, oil-rich countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, are actually quite close to it, to adopting some kind of universal basic income, but for a different reason from Finland or India. It's actually because the way they redistribute oil revenues today is extraordinarily inefficient. The way they do it is actually take a country like Kuwait. They redistribute oil revenues in 2 ways: energy subsidies and the civil service employment. 2 of the least productive ways of distributing oil revenues. And what they're finding, in Kuwait, you have 95% of the male labor force is in the public sector. Right? They're not doing anything, but they're getting paid, and that's how they get their oil revenues. And then they have the Minister of Finance of Kuwait comes to see me and says, "Help me develop the private sector in Kuwait." Well, it's hard to do that when you got this highly paid and almost universal public sector.
And everybody finishes work at 1 p.m., right? Everybody finishes work at 1 p.m.
Exactly.
Right.
They finish your work and then they, well, we won't go into that. But the point is, you can still redistribute the oil revenues without having to make them come to work in the public sector. And if you distribute those oil revenues directly to the public, some of them might actually start a business. Because right now, that doesn't pay for them to start a business. But if you give them the money and say, do whatever you like with it, some of them will just lie on the beach or go surfing. Some of them will educate their kids or go abroad, and some of them might start a business. And that's how you can generate the entrepreneurship that is needed for these societies to be diversified in the long run.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask the panel. We're coming towards the end of our debate. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give me a less than 1 minute, a sub 1 minute wrap-up statement. It can be a long sentence if you like. But what I'm also going to do is, Ilka, I've had a question online that's been directed at you. So if you could perhaps, you can have a little more time to answer the question and give me your wrap-up long sentence, complex sentence. So I'll come to you first, and then we're going to rerun the vote, right, to see whether this debate has succeeded in shifting anyone's views or succeeded in not shifting their views, well, depending on your perspective. So the question, Ilka, is Elise, who's from the Ministry of Health in Mexico, wants to ask you, you mentioned the rise in technology taking over human jobs. If formal and informal employment are going to fall imminently, shouldn't we start delinking work from income altogether? So if you could respond to that and give me your closing statement, if you would, please.
Sure. I think we have to do all we can to avoid the fall in employment. I don't think it's inevitable. It's not something we're really seeing in a very, very large scale at the moment. It's employment rates are still quite high, and it's a future that is much talked about, but much less seen. And if we arrive at a situation where robots take all our jobs, then we have the opportunity to change our social benefit systems. But we don't have to do that before it actually happens. That's a sort of just closing statement. I think I consider a high level of social benefits important for social cohesion and alleviating poverty and enabling all people to have a decent level of living. And I think a targeted system where feasible to implement is a better way of achieving it than UBI.
Okay. Thank you. Very comprehensive. David, you're still preparing your closing statement, I think so. Shamika, you are too. Shanta, you look ready. Let me go to you next.
Okay. Actually, I want to go back to the point I made at the very beginning. There are three very different reasons for UBI, and we have to be very clear that you don't apply the same reason across the board. So, for instance, in Finland, if the social welfare program is working, then don't upset it. You don't want to change it. What I understand from my limited exposure to the Finnish situation is that the unemployment benefit system is not working, which is why they're piloting this UBI experiment. So that one is the one that you need to fix, not the other social benefits or the disability and everything else. Similarly, in India, it's the subsidy system that's not working and some of the cash transfers. So let's fix that with UBI. And then in the oil-rich countries, it's the whole public expenditure system that is not working. And so let's fix that with a UBI. So there are different reasons in different countries which are solving different problems for which you have UBI. So let's not upset what's already working. Let's focus on what's not working.
Great. Thank you. Shamika, let me come to you for your closing remark.
Sure. So I would again like to focus on the Indian case because for me that is the greatest motivation here.
Yeah.
I think the UBI must replace food, fertilizer and fuel subsidy. It should not be an additional instrument. The universal appeal is to address absolute poverty to begin with. But over time, as the tax base gets strengthened, we will have more resources to transfer more to the poor, and in the process also address the problem of income inequality. Going back to David's point, there will still remain corruption, but it is not going to be because of targeted subsidy towards the poor. Corruption will be of other forms, but that's not the objective of today's discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. As we have the pleasure of having you in the room, you have the honour of having the closing word on this, David.
Well, thank you very much. I think it was Francis Bacon said the truth emerges...
The painter or the philosopher?
Philosopher. The truth emerges out of error rather than confusion. And I think it's been actually rather helpful, this debate in clarifying some differences, and as has been said, different problems need different solutions, but they're all, in a sense, trying to tackle inequality, and I think everyone's agreed that social benefits of some form are very important in that. If you just focus, if I may focus at the end on children, that you can't pay UBI to a 3-year-old. I mean, the question is, who do you pay it to? Do you pay it to the father who controls the household? Do you pay it to the mother, who's maybe more likely, as has been said, to be empowered and spend it for the benefit of those children? Is it better to do that in that form, or to have it in the form of school meals, which may encourage children to be able to afford to go to school without having to work in child labour? That doesn't seem to me obvious. It doesn't all obviously point towards UBI, and thinking about the circumstances, the challenge, and the different ways of doing things seem to me really important.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, this feels like a pretty rapid run through many different national contexts, different arguments, so different rationales for and against this. Let me be interesting to see where this has landed with you as an audience. So if you could get your phones out again, please. You'll see it the same URL. If you could vote now. Now, the first time round, it was somewhere between 95 to 96% yes, there should be. Let me just, people look like they're still voting. You're still voting. Want to make sure we've got good turnout. We should have made it compulsory registration like in the French system. Okay. Right, let's have the grand reveal. What has this debate, exposure to this debate, done to our audience? Oh, wow, okay, that's had quite a significant impact. 66% now say yes, and 34% now say no. I think that shows the value of having a conversation around these things. I think it feels to me like there's a lot more that can and should be discussed about this, and particularly as we start to see the results coming from some of these pilots. I know that the Finnish pilot finishes in December 2018. There'll be the final results from that. I say the Kenyan example, that's a 12-year RCT. There's going to be ongoing results from that, but I think our kind of conceptualization of this will be refined as we see more of the results. Can we go back to having everyone?
It's going up.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Quick. Before it changes further, I should say that at ODI we haven't at the moment published anything explicitly on UBI, but Francesca's program is regularly publishing on cash transfers and other forms of social protection. In my program, we're publishing a paper on informality. We're looking at jobs writ large. Colleagues have been publishing on automation, and we're going to publish more on automation. We've written on the gig economy. So lots of kind of relevant issues. Maybe some point we will actually write a publication on UBI as well. Who knows? All that remains for me now is to thank. Let me start actually by thanking everyone in the room. Let me do it in an informal way, and everyone online. Thank you so much for your participation. And let me thank the speakers, Ilkka in Finland, Shamika in Delhi, Shanta in DC, and David here in London, and invite you to tea and biscuits outside, except if you're online. Thanks very much.